late 1800s until 1970s, my paternal grandparents lived in the Peak, Derbyshire, Sheffield locality. Their earlier generation resided in the Cumbrian coast area of Whitehaven and St. Bees. And I associate this background influenced their choice of subject matter in their painting collection, which included maritime scenes by local architects. By the later 1930s, I was old enough to take a serious interest in the pictures. I was particularly drawn to an unsigned oil on wood board featuring a brig under sail in coastal heavy weather. Later research on the oil identified the scene to the Solway Firth north of Maryport. The artist William Mitchell, 1806 to 1900, who was based at Maryport. Basil Greenhill's book, Photos of Victorian Edwardian Sailing Ships, includes the photo of the Sutherland, built at Maryport in 1881, and showing similar sheer strake painted with those distinctive false gun ports. Now, I'm just wondering if there's any connection, the coincidence between the painting and this particular ship. The collection also included two by the Sheffield artist Thomas Bush Harvey, 1842-1897. He was a well-known prolific painter of marine and coastal watercolours. This particular one, Landing Fish at Portel, was painted in 1888 and was obviously a much calmer scene for the later Victorian living room walls. The second T.B. Hardy watercolour depicted this Dutch winter river scene, and perhaps this was my passport to a later long association with the Netherlands. My parents moved from Sheffield to Coventry in 1931, where my father was an engineer with the Standard Motor Company. From 1932 to 1948, I was therefore resident as far away from the sea as you can get in the UK. Apart from the World War II years, however, we enjoyed the 2-week annual breaks in North Sea coast resorts. At grammar school, one subject was non-scholarly. For the first term, I was assigned to the art class, which revealed my lack of talent. So I was transferred to the woodwork and draftsmanship section. And despite the war years in the Midlands having Air Force, friendly and otherwise, I might say, and army-dominated environments, my own interests from one influence or another had a strong nautical bias. And in comparison with local engineering industries, post-war replacement of war losses of merchant ships suggested a sound alternative prospective employment area. Following 2 years at the Nautical Training College, HMS Worcester in the Thames, shown here, and the Cuddy Sarkers alongside, I signed for an apprenticeship with the Anglo-Saxon Petroleum Company, which was the sea tanker transport arm of Royal Dutch Shell, which was then taking delivery of new ships every 2 weeks. Earlier ship model making continued afloat, drawing plans, utilizing scrap materials, but any painting was limited to some minor sketch attempts in watercolor and also the bitumen and red lead on ship structures. Unforeseen by 1953 was that Shell had overestimated requirements for their own and charter tanker tonnage. 50 of their own fleet had been laid up and no third mate positions were on offer, so I joined the Ellerman dry cargo fleet. Up till about 1950, it was customary for most merchant ship owners to have paintings of their vessels for boardroom or publicity purposes. Their ships would usually be depicted in trading localities, but photography dominated the subject thereafter. I was married in 1956. My wife was a keen amateur artist in watercolors, acrylics, and oils, and she regularly attended classes over the next 60 years. And our mutual hobbies dovetailed nicely, though she was also keen for me to take up painting as well as the ship model building. But on a compromise basis, as I had an eye for detail, I served as her critic and picture frame maker. Sheila also supported our Model Shipwrights biennial exhibitions picture section with exhibits and was awarded a bronze for this one, her winter berth, in 2000. In 1963, I obtained shore-based employment with the London-based shipbrokers, primarily to manage a UK agency for the Amsterdam Dry Dock Company, ADM, had their shipyard in Amsterdam. This particular canal scene, a reproduction from an oil by John Hunt of Sandwich, served as a happy memory of my first visit to the port. And the clarity of the painting is almost as iPhone photographic, quite incredible. In the following years, I was intermediary in the acquisition of a fleet of new and second-hand bulk carriers for a Philippine client, and in thereafter operational management. And shipyard activity had now become a 24-hour occupation, but provided income to indulge in the purchase of a traditional ship subject pictures from the Royal Exchange Art Gallery in London, which was only a heaving line distant from my London office. In 1982, a contract was signed for a new 35,000-ton bulk carrier at Govan Shipyard on the Clyde. And I visited during construction, represented owners at launch and sea trials, and later overseas when she was on charter. Govan shipbuilders printed their own publicity brochure to illustrate this contract, which included a nighttime photograph. At long last, I persuaded myself this was the opportunity to surprise my wife by copying the picture in a watercolour on a subject I knew so well. At this time, I also had in mind a book of watercolour pictures published in 1952 by the Amsterdam Dry Dock Company on the occasion of their 75th anniversary. 4 Dutch artists were given freedom of the yard to give expression of the beauty of human labour and activity which characterises the shipbuilding and ship repairing trade. And the colours and shades were so vibrant that I was sure that a watercolour was the best medium to illustrate an industrial scene. Therefore, I've included this copy of the Riveters as an example. On the occasion of a visit to the London Mould Gallery exhibition by work of members of the Royal Society of Marine Officers in 1987, and my current then retirement from the shipping industry, I couldn't resist buying the Mark Myers watercolour depicting Uganda and the Walmer Castle, which was a very tranquil scene which contrasted with the working life with ships in hazardous environments, which had been my wont for a few previous years. And finally, during retirement in 1991, we joined a friends group from Greenwich Maritime Museum in a visit to the USA New England Maritime Museums. And I took a quayside photo at Mystic Seaport, and this inspired my last attempt at a watercolour version. So I made this little watercolour from the photograph I'd taken. Future good intentions are still unrealised, but my daughter thinks an interior picture of my workshop would be a good start. But for now, this is why I have a house full of artist materials, a collector's book library, and walls covered with pictures. Thank you.
I'm giving this short talk on behalf of Ron Thornton, who is unable to be with us tonight. He is a great admirer of Winslow Homer, but is a competent marine painter himself, so I pressed him to include 2 of his own paintings. I'm going to take it slowly so you have time to study the paintings. We will start with the American painter of some note, Winslow Homer, born 1836, died 1910. So in Ron's words, here we go. I'm an admirer of this artist's marine paintings. He has created, in my view, the most powerful images which are full of drama. His mastery of perilous seas creates an air of tension so that you're drawn in, hoping that ultimately all will be well. In this painting, Lifeline, it's called, the light is carefully controlled. A sinister sky and mountainous seas are contributing to the perilous situation of those being rescued. It is clearly not a simple rescue. They're only just clear of the seas. However, one of the rescuer's legs is submerged and dragging in the waves. Will they make it? Now, I assume this picture, titled The Fog Warning, is a scene from fishing on the Grand Banks. The inky sea is rough, which must make rowing difficult, and the fog is very visible. The fisherman's head is turned, searching for his schooner, which is very far away on the horizon. Will he make it before the fog descends? Now, this painting, The Gulf Stream, is perhaps Homer's most famous painting. Severely damaged, with mast and bowsprit gone, and surrounded by many sharks, there is so much drama. To add even more tension to this scene, there is a typhoon on the horizon, and the hapless man on the boat can do little to improve his perilous situation. Has it passed and caused the damage? Is it going to arrive, or will he be saved by the faint ship on the horizon, half left? Now, this painting has no title. Initially, I thought this was a follow-up painting to the Gulf Stream, but it is a different boat, similarly damaged, but without any sign of crew. I like to think that in this painting, the occupants have been rescued by the tiny vessel on the horizon, rather than having fallen prey to the marauding sharks. In my own unremarkable way, I tried to create impact, or at least interest, largely by the control of light. In Evening Sail here, I have used white gouache to reflect the light in an otherwise darkened image. Now, the second painting, The Vessel at Speed, is a charcoal drawing with the vessel left almost unpainted. The sea again is created by the use of white gouache by brush and spatter technique. There is another technique I use to create impact, and that is to have the image cut off. I have two 90-degree pieces of card, which I adjust for the best image. Maybe cheating, but worth trying to see if your paintings can be enhanced with partial images. And it is evident in many of Homer's paintings. It has the effect of putting the image in your face. The clipper in my painting, in Morning Fog, is almost coming out of the painting as a result. Finally, as a further illustration, here is a harbour scene painted by Egon Schiele, the Austrian artist, where almost every vessel is cut off, making a very successful image. Now, that is the end of Ron's contribution, but I would like to reinforce his last point by demonstrating this business of zooming in on the subject to create drama. I'm going to show you two slides in quick succession to show you the impact of zooming in on a subject. Here we have the bigger picture, and here we are into action. And to reinforce this point, here is a masterful painting, but it grips you. Finally, here are three paintings that create the drama of the sea. Unsurprisingly, they speak for themselves. This is an Atlantic storm painted by a very, very famous painter at the end of the 1900s, early 2000s, and it's John Singer Sargent. Fantastic. And actually, when you see the real thing, which I have done, is terrifying. Next is a bark running in a heavy sea by summer scales. And finally, a merchantman punching into a gale of at least force 9 by Mason.
I must describe myself really as a cowardly painter of water. I would like to be able to rise to the challenge inspired by John Masefield's poem, Sea Fever, which in the second verse says, which some of you may know anyway, I must down to the seas again, for the call of the running tide is a wild call and a care call that may not be denied. And all I ask is a windy day with the white clouds flying and the flung spray and the blown spume and the seagulls crying. Well, we've certainly seen all of that in what has just been told to us. This is my first effort, and of course, as you can see, it's pretty calm. The original painting is slightly more highly coloured than that, but it is all about a sunrise on Lady Elliot Island in Australia, which involved me getting up at 4 in the morning and waiting for the best moment to apply paint to water. The only other interesting thing was I picked up a twig off the shoreline and incorporated it into one of my own models as a tiller. The next painting I want to show you is of the old harbour. Again, it's more highly coloured, actually, at least than what I see on my own screen here. And I sat on some steps. That was a bit hazardous because there were a set of drunks behind me armed with bottles. And the only connection actually with John Masefield's poem, as in flung spray, was they flung 1 or 2 bottles, more or less in my direction, but not very good aim. The old harbour, Stara Luka, is a wonderful sight. This painting that you now see in front of you is the harbour front in Hvar, again in Croatia, because we owned a house there, and was at least an attempt, which you can't see terribly well here, at rather more unsettled water, as per all these fishing boats and the front of the old town of Hvar. The next painting is a view of the island of Bardia, which is a little island off the much bigger island called Korčula. And my friend Boris Marilich owns a house from where I painted this across this stretch of water. And my very athletic Australian daughter-in-law swam across the piece of water you see with her husband and brother-in-law driving a motorboat round and round her to protect her against oncoming speedboats of one sort or another. The island of Bardia is a lovely little place, really, and you see the lighter part, which is in fact a monastery. If we go to the next painting, this is the waterfront on one side of Korčula town. I had to paint this at high speed as dusk was setting in, but for those who are interested in World War II history, this was the Croatian home on Korčula, in the town of Korčula, Sir Fitzroy Maclean. The scenery around his Scottish home at Strachur beside Loch Fyne, funnily enough, bears a very strong resemblance to that of Korčula. I visited Strachur some years later, and his grave in the local churchyard, his gravestone proclaims the fact that he was the 15th keeper of the seas, which is a Scottish hereditary title, in addition to him being a Knight of the Thistle. The next painting is of a dhow being built, ready for voyages to Zanzibar, about which I think Ian knows a great deal more than me. There's no sea there, but the sea is very close to, and so I was surrounded by the boat builders as they got cracking in Bahrain, building their dhow, and lots of others which were either being repaired or new ones being made. The next one from me is the sea below an oil rig in the Persian Gulf. Now, this shows a bit more colour, and you might think, bearing in mind what's going on today, that the things in the air to the right might be drones. Well, I'm glad to say they were only seagulls. They're going back to, of course, John Masefield's poem about seagulls crying. And this was painted because my son, Angus, was able to get me flown out to a Saudi Aramco oil rig in the middle of the Persian Gulf. And I spent some 24 hours drawing and painting this last image under constant pressure to complete before an evacuation exercise took place. During the night, I witnessed another oil rig, an Iranian one, only some 7 miles away, burning off excess gas, which demonstrated the close and mingled nature of rival oil giants in that volatile sea. I end with this picture by Sir Winston Churchill, which was hung in the room in Blenheim Palace, where he was born, showing his version of water. He was advised by various well-known artists of his day, and he derived terrific pleasure from his painting career as an antidote to his political life, especially after the ghastly Dardanelles campaign. It was he, though, in the Second World War, of course, who sent Sir Fitzroy Maclean, who I've just mentioned, to Yugoslavia after 1941 to contact Tito with the command, and here I apologize to anybody of German nationality who may be listening, with the command, find out who is killing the most Germans. And with that, Fitzroy parachuted into Montenegro, joined up with Tito and carried on. And he did so well as far as Tito was concerned that is why he was the only British person for a long time allowed to own a house in Croatia, and that house was in Korčula. Thank you very much.
If you wish to make a model of a modern merchantman or warship, you will probably have a good choice of photographs to support your planning for the model. In the case of those of us who wish to model ships from the 17th century, that is not possible. Therefore, we have to delve into the collections of the old masters. As some of you know, I have an obsession about the early sloops of war, and particularly the vessels from which they originated. These were the ketch, the yacht, and the naval sloop. It's about the latter that I'm going to talk now, and the essential evidence of their form and detail as portrayed in the paintings, grisaille, and sketches of the Van der Vels, father and son. Now, before going any further, others have been on the team examining this graphic evidence and working out how to interpret it for the development and reconstruction leading to the building of a model. They are David Anshell from the model ships of Niagara, and also a member of the Stuart Yacht Research Group. Effie Moneypenny in this country, also from the Stuart Yacht Research Group, and Alan O'Neill, known to you all, who with great patience and skill translated the evidence and our ideas into a working draft. John Garnish also joined the team later on and kindly offered to consider building a model to prove the feasibility of the project. Now here we have an oil painting of the Battle of Texel. The large picture gives us little information, but we can identify the sloops out in front of the line. And they're on the right-hand side bottom with two masts. More detail is available by zooming in on target, and this gives us a general understanding of the sail plan, the steeve of the bowsprit, and the run of the shear line. You can see all those points in this sloop in the center at the bottom. And again at Schoenfeld, the large picture and the detail, this one gives us a better view with just a touch more detail. Now this grisaille is very instructive. It measures only 15 inches by 12 inches, but the detail is staggering. Now we're going to home in on the bottom left to view two naval sloops. There we are. First, to see the general detail, and second, to examine their rigging. We wanted to establish the system of shrouds and the nature of the masts, which appear as a two-part mast on the main and the aftermost mast, whilst the foremast is a pole mast. Now we turn to the sketch of one particular sloop, the Bonetta, which contributed more than anything else to the development of what was to be a reconstruction draft. Now, this sketch is by Van der Velde the Younger and was done well after the Naval War of 1673. There's been some discussion of how exactly this vessel was rigged, as there is some evidence that a mizzenmast is shown here on the quarterdeck, the slightly sloping lines just before the taffrail. Here, indeed, there's a picture of one of the battles of 1673 that shows a sloop with a mizzen. However, the majority of pictures we examined showed sloops with two-mast rig. Now, this next sketch, also by Van der Velde the Younger, is of Emsworth. But she was built in 1666 and is rather different in form to the later 1673 batch. However, there are some details here that are worth noting to complete the reconstruction of the later sloop from 1673, such as the size of the anchor, the stowage of the sweeps along the quarter, the location and design of the scuppers, and they are in the center just above the whale, difficult to see here, and the height and size of the gun. Again, difficult in this to show, but you can see two, actually, one midships and one at the beginning of the quarter. You will note that this particular sloop has a mizzenmast. We have another contemporary print of a small yacht with a rig similar to the sloop's, or with what seems like a boom gaff-headed sail behind the main course. Another, here depicted departing from Calais as part of the escort from Mary of Modena, shortly to be married to James II, presents another interesting variation, in that the main course, which is a bus sail with a much higher aspect ratio than the normal main course, has been hoisted off-center so that it can act more like a lugsail, giving the sloop a more weatherly capability. And that was needed because the other vessels of the escort were yachts with fore and aft rigs. Now, you can see in this next detail, which is the arrival of this group at Dover, how well trained round those courses are because of the way they've been hoisted. So all this put together begins to give an understanding of how sloops were set up. I always find that drawing helps me to work out how everything might have appeared. So I set to and produce my own impressions of what these tiny warships might look like. Here in an oil painting, and here in a strong blow off the Dutch coast. The first was a oil color. This is a watercolor with crayon, so I suppose you call it multimedia. Again, using the Van der Velde sketch of Bonetta, I attempted a couple of perspective drawings to try and work out the shape of the hull from both the bow and the quarter. I then set up a profile and incorrectly drew the oarsmen sitting rather than standing to operate their sweeps. I also attempted a preliminary sail plan. But to help us with reconstruction, we needed to find a plan of some early craft of similar size. Now, these naval sloops were intended to tow wounded ships of the line out of the line of battle. So in effect, they were massive rowing boats. We managed to find the sort of boat from a slightly later period, which would have been used for towing ships in a calm, the longboat. This one at 32 feet overall, exactly half the length of the Bonetta at 64 feet. So it became, together with the Van der Velde sketch and the grisaille, the basis of the reconstruction shown here. There's an intermediate draft, which is still being worked on as I speak. It will become the center point of a future joint presentation between Alan O'Neill and myself. Right, well, that's it. I'd just like to close by saying we couldn't have got anywhere without the graphic information supplied by these early master paintings, and in one case by a plan of a later boat. So they do have value to the model maker who wants to do something from an early time.
As part of tonight's discussion of marine painting, I've been asked to give a revised version of a talk I gave at the 2023 World Ship Society Naval Meeting on the German artist Klaus Bergen, whom I've dubbed the marine maler von Bayern, naval artist from Bavaria, which might seem strange as Bavaria is many miles from the sea in any direction, but it's nonetheless true. He's a man whose work I've admired for some years, although as a person I consider him interesting rather than likable. If you don't know the name of Klaus Bergen, which is perhaps better known in the USA and Germany than the UK, I'd certainly expect most of you to have seen at least a few of his pictures in recent years, especially in connection with the centenaries of the events of the 1914-1919 Great War. Klaus Bergen was, in my opinion, the most accomplished of Germany's politischer Marinmaler, political naval artists, who from 1871 through 1945 were encouraged by those in authority to produce what were literally favourable images of German maritime power. His work is certainly on a par with that of the British W.L. Wiley, and in my view, superior to Wiley's. But while both men were methodical, Wiley was at his best when painting what he saw, whereas Bergen also had an extraordinary ability to depict things as others had seen them, and hence was probably the most influential of the political marine artists, not least in assisting promotion of the revival of the German Navy after the Great War. Klaus was the eldest son of Friedrich, aka Fritz, Bergen, who was a well-to-do commercial artist and illustrator. While still at elementary school, Klaus showed artistic talent, which his father recognized and encouraged. And after Klaus left high school, Fritz had him coached for entry into the Bavarian Royal Academy of Fine Art. And after his son graduated, Fritz secured Klaus a position illustrating the works of Karl May, popular travel and adventure stories, which were probably the most widely read books in Germany at the time. By the age of 25, Klaus had also exhibited in the annual Bavarian International Art Exhibitions in Munich, and 2 or 3 years later was sufficiently well known to prosper as a freelance, which enabled him to make study trips abroad, notably to Cornwall, which he visited 4 times before the Great War, and subsequently made a number of paintings which were his first significant works as a marine artist. In August 1914, he was not called up. He was then aged 29 and had no military experience, for on leaving high school, he had been exempted from the customary year of the military service because he remained a full-time student. Instead, he worked for some 12 months producing fundraising artwork in support of the war effort. This striking image of the sinking of the Lusitania by U-20, in propaganda terms, a definite own goal for Germany, but a bonus for the artist. For on the strength of that illustration, his application to be accredited to the Imperial Navy as a war artist was accepted. For 3 years from December 1915, he resided in Wilhelmshaven, and his first major commission was to depict the claimed victory of the High Seas Fleet in the Skagerrak, the Battle off Jutland. He did not witness the battle himself, as the policy at the time was that war artists, etc., should not be embarked during operations. But with the support of Admirals Scheer and Hipper, he diligently collected documents, interviewed the principal commanders and many other eyewitnesses, and went to sea during subsequent battle practice exercises. Over the second 6 months of 1916, he made numerous sketches, watercolours, and finally oil paintings, which he showed at a major exhibition of naval war art, which opened in Wilhelmshaven in January 1917. He would subsequently be dubbed Maler de Skagerrakslacht, the artist of Jutland. And such was the realism of his work that many, including veterans of the battle, believed the artist must himself have been an eyewitness, which Bergen never actually claimed, though for some 30 years he made little effort to refute the tale, which was effectively a testament to his powers of imagination and artistry. At this point, I will speculate that he could have made use of so-called builders' models, like that of HMS Canada, which I recently spoke of, in his effort to envisage what the ships had looked like at sea. Pure speculation, but nonetheless credible, because contemporary builders of warships in particular frequently commissioned such models for public display, and the models were often completed before the ship itself. There were thus almost certain to have been such models available for the artists to study in the second half of 1916. And you'll have heard me say before that such models have enduring value in that they typically survive long after the model which they depict, long after the ship which they depict has disappeared. Nonetheless, I'll take this opportunity to say so again. Subsequently, in July 1917, he was allowed to embark in U-53 for a war patrol in the northwest approaches to the UK, which resulted in another significant series of artworks, although in my particular context, these are not as important as his Jutland pictures. The following year, he displayed over 40 of his war at sea paintings at a major exhibition in Munich. On the opening day, the 1st of June 1918, he escorted the King of Bavaria around the galleries and was awarded by the King the honorary title of Professor. It would be fair to say, therefore, that Klaus Bergen had a good war, which was more than can be said for the Kaiserliche Marine, the Imperial German Navy, especially latterly. Posters, etc., proclaiming the stab in the back myth might display the soldier's assailant as a Jew or as a red, as in this illustration bottom left, but could equally well have shown a blue jacket. The naval mutinies, which began at Wilhelmshaven and Kiel at the very end of October 1918, didn't just affect the fleet and its base ports. From early November, bands of armed naval ratings ranged across Germany, proclaiming "Long live the Socialist Republic." And their intervention in the rapidly worsening political crisis was substantially responsible for Germany, which had hitherto been more a federation than a nation, becoming an republic almost by accident, and certainly against the wishes of the many politicians and ordinary folk who would have favoured constitutional monarchy. A consequence throughout the period 1919 through 1933 was endemic political instability. Nobody had given serious thought beforehand as to how a German republic would be organised or how it would function as a liberal democracy. And while both radicals and conservatives were only too ready to work against the central government, it had no consistent body of popular support. An immediate consequence was a period of some 30 months from December 1918, the Freikorps era, during which there were frequent instances of what were effectively local civil wars. A crucial point for the Navy during this period was the Kapp Putsch in March 1920, an attempted coup d'etat supported by naval Freikorps units and many naval officers, including the head of the service, but which failed largely because naval other ranks refused to support it. In its aftermath, many politicians and army officers questioned whether the new Germany needed a navy which was plainly dysfunctional. But in the event, a new head of the service was appointed who recognized the need for the navy to be all of one company, subordinate to the government of the day, and to have clearly defined roles which supported the government's objectives. After 1945, it's been all too easy to see the Reichsmarine, Germany's navy from 1919 through 1935, as merely a precursor of Hitler's Kriegsmarine. Admiral Benck's vision, however, was of a modestly sized navy, constrained not only by the Versailles Treaty, but by Germany's serious economic constraints in the 1920s, which nonetheless had first-class personnel and technology. Not primarily a war-fighting service, although capable of defending Germany's interests in the Baltic and the North Sea, but with a very important objective being to assist by showing the flag, the restoration of Germany's status in the world after a war which had left it with virtually no friends among other nations. Hence the sentiments expressed by Admiral Benck to naval cadets and midshipmen at Murvik, the German Naval Officer Training School, which even looks a bit like BRNC Dartmouth, in 1923 at the unveiling of a Skagerrak memorial. The words on the slide aren't that easy to read, so I'll read them out. Just as our old naval ensign symbolizes past glory, the Admiral said, so the new flag should also fly proudly as a symbol of German maritime power. Our new navy may be small and its material outdated, but its men can be proficient in military, maritime and technical skills. Inspired by General Skagerrak Geist and patriotism, and standing together in loyal companionship, we can be optimistic that we may rebuild and maintain a first-class navy. There's vision for you. After some 4 years of political chaos, and with Germany still afflicted by hyperinflation, the Admiral was saying, we may be down, but we are definitely not out. And he was right. What of that Skagerrak Geist, Jutland spirit? Of course, the Battle off Jutland wasn't a victory for the High Seas Fleet, not even a tactical victory, as Admiral Scheer himself effectively acknowledged thereafter. Nonetheless, the High Seas Fleet had been skillfully handled and had fought well. At times, as when German destroyers charged towards the Grand Fleet battle line, at times with near suicidal bravery. It was unquestionably the finest hour of the Kaiserlich Marine, during which the Royal Navy had unquestionably been given a rude shock. The Kaiser himself had declared after the battle that every man, whatever his rank or task, had done his duty, and as senior officers of the Reichsmarine sought an outstanding example of the wartime heroism, self-sacrifice, dedication to duty, achievements, etc., of the old Navy to inspire the new Navy, the Skagerrak Schlacht clearly met the requirement. From 1923 onward, Skagerrak Tag, Skagerrak Day, had the same significance for the Reichsmarine and subsequently the Kriegsmarine as Trafalgar Day for the Royal Navy. Perhaps more so later, because from 1924, German warships would hoist the old Imperial war flag on that day and continued to do so even during the years of the Third Reich. The glorious 31st of May was certainly a more inspiring example for the new Reichsmarine than the 21st of June, despite efforts in its immediate aftermath to persuade the German public that the Navy had somehow salvaged its honour by scuttling its battle fleet. But throughout the politically turbulent period from the end 1918 German Revolution to the end of 1923, when the currency was stabilised, Klaus Bergen took little interest in politics. He didn't work for or publicly identify with any political faction. And though he described himself as a marine artist, a fair number of his paintings were landscapes, because as a trained artist, he was capable of depicting a wide variety of subjects, although sticking exclusively to the traditional Munich school naturalism stroke realism, i.e. depicting subjects as the eye would see them, an approach which would subsequently serve him well during the Third Reich. That said, he joined the NSDAP, the Nazi Party, in 1922 or 1923, but he allowed his membership to lapse after the party was outlawed at the end of 1923. He rejoined in October 1932, at the time of a general rush to join the party, but he was never a fervent Nazi and certainly not overtly anti-Semitic, only to avoid offending wealthy American clients. Throughout the early 1920s, he took commissions from organizations or individuals. He was, of course, widely known from his previous work. He made study trips, produced pictures for galleries and exhibitions. At the end of 1918, he had left Wilhelmshaven and returned to Munich. Thereafter, he lived the rest of his life in southern Bavaria, where he was no longer literally alongside the Navy, but nonetheless maintained contact, which was very much a characteristic of his, although somewhat stiff and aloof, as many middle-class German men of that era were. He nonetheless had good friends and a large number of acquaintances stroke contacts from whom he would not only take any opportunity to do an honest day's artistry, but he took care to seek out such opportunities. And in November 1924, an opportunity came in the form of a request from an officer in the Navy's Baltic headquarters for assistance in procuring for the Reichsmarine a significant number of artworks to foster awareness of naval history and tradition among the younger personnel of today's Navy. The artist of Jutland saw his chance to be the artist of the Reichsmarine, and he seized it. Thereafter, he would promote the Navy for some 20 years. Something of an oversimplification, because he did a good deal of other work besides. His principal concern throughout his adult life was to maintain a comfortable middle-class lifestyle as a respected artist. But it is fair comment in my particular context, for it allows further simplification of dividing his years 1925 through 1945 into 4 phases. The second half of the 1920s, the Weimar Republic's golden 20s, were a time of optimism for the Reichsmarine. Germany was admitted to the League of Nations in 1926. German warships ranged increasingly far afield, showing the flag. Good progress was made in reconstructing existing vessels and building new ones. In the autumn of 1929, however, the Wall Street crash triggered the Great Depression, which hit Germany especially hard because the legacy of the 1922-23 hyperinflation, which at the time had largely wiped out German war debt, was heavy reliance upon loans from the USA. As a direct consequence of the Great Depression, Hitler was elected Chancellor and initiated what was in effect a second and even more radical German Revolution. There followed, in the 1930s, what were for the great majority of Germans 6 so-called happy years of increasing prosperity, a period in which the Navy also prospered greatly, although the relationship between the naval authorities and the Nazi Party always tended to be one of mutual distrust, which for the Navy's part would prove fully justified in 1939, when the Kriegsmarine was pitched into a war which its leaders didn't want and for which it certainly wasn't ready. From that first period, however, 1925-29, dates this impressive work showing the recently modernized battleship Hessen in a Norwegian fjord in mid-1925. Throughout the 1920s, the German government was keen to repair relationships with Norway, which had suffered during the Great War, when German submarines had sunk several Norwegian merchant vessels. Also from that period dates Under the New Flag. The original work by Klaus Bergen is top right. He subsequently reworked it to place the Reichsmarine's battleships, some of which were Jutland veterans, literally under the new flag, as you'll see to the left. That particular work may have influenced the decision to invite Klaus Bergen to embark in the battleship Hessen in May-June 1926 for a cruise by a Reichsmarine squadron, 4 battleships and 2 light cruisers, to Spain's Atlantic and Mediterranean ports. At the time, the German government was negotiating to join the League of Nations, which Germany did in September 1926. And this flag-showing exercise made a very good impression within Germany and elsewhere, in which respect Klaus Bergen must have made some contribution, for over the following 2 years or so he made and exhibited several paintings based upon his experience. Some of those paintings illustrated a handsome souvenir booklet which was compiled by Hessen's officers and published in 1928. Bergen sent copies towards the end of that year to Admiral Erich Raeder, the newly appointed chief of the Reichsmarine, and also to Raeder's chief of staff, who had recently commanded the Hessen. There followed an invitation for Bergen to visit Admiral Raeder and subsequent commissions to paint pictures of the Skagerrak Schlacht, of course, for Raeder's offices, and also to illustrate a commemorative publication marking the 80th birthday of Gross Admiral von Tirpitz. This was definitely a matter of old acquaintance ne'er being forgot. Raeder had been Admiral Hipper's chief of staff from 1913 until June 1918. He was thus certain to know of Bergen's work, and had very probably met the artist during the second half of 1916. That Raeder knew of, and can be assumed to have approved of, Bergen's reputation undoubtedly secured for the artist a steady stream of invitations, commissions, etc., well into the years of the Second World War. Raeder, I'll digress for a moment, was Imperial Navy through and through, devoted to the service, a practicing Christian, always inclined to be wary of the Nazis. He never really joined the party, although he was awarded membership in 1935. He was thus unusual in retaining his Weimar Republic position as head of the service after Hitler came to power. And at an early stage, he impressed upon Hitler, who'd hitherto barely considered naval matters, his own neo-Tirpitzian view that a great nation should have a great navy, or, to be realistic, a first-class navy, prestigious, conferring reach, able to defend and or advance Germany's interests. The operations of the Kriegsmarine during the Spanish Civil War were a good example of Raeder's thinking in practice, and one of the few occasions between 1871 and 1945 when Germany's navy actually achieved something useful in support of the German government's political objectives. On the other hand, Hitler's directive in the spring of 1938 that Britain should be considered a potential enemy, the foundation of the so-called Z Plan, caused Raeder great concern. He essentially played for time, pointing out that even if there were no war in the interim, it would be at least 6 to 8 years before the fleet was sufficiently enlarged for a conflict against Britain. That didn't happen, of course, when war came 18 months later. Admiral Raeder opined privately that the best the Navy could achieve would be to die gallantly. But as I say, I digress. In the late 1920s, Bergen, with Raeder's support, continued illustrating the development of the Reichsmarine. Here we see the Emden, the service's first new construction unit, and wholly characteristically a training cruiser, because the German navies have always taken sea training very seriously. Here it's seen with Versailles Treaty legacy units. While here are Bergen's paintings of the ships of the Reichsmarine's first major new construction program, 12 torpedo boats of the 1923 and 1924 types, which entered service 1926 through 1929. Here an image of another battle squadron deployment to the Mediterranean, this time in 1930, when Klaus Bergen was once again invited to embark in the Hessen, which is seen here at Venice. A more somber pair of sketches from the Great Depression period here. Hitler would be elected chancellor because while mainstream politicians had failed, he and his party promised the restoration of both order and prosperity, which in the short term they achieved to an extent. But of course, there were also developments which hadn't been promised and which were far less attractive. But a development which Hitler had promised since the early 1920s was renunciation of the Versailles Treaty, which wasn't publicly announced until the spring of 1935. But even in the days of the Weimar Republic, the Navy and elements of the government had aspired to re-establish a U-boat flotilla, which in the defensive context actually made good sense and was certainly an aspiration which Klaus Bergen supported from the mid-1920s onwards. Also controversial were the Panzerschiff, aka pocket battleships, the first of which was laid down early in 1929 and completed in April 1933. They were just about allowed within the terms of the Versailles Treaty, but certainly not what the victors had intended in 1919. They suited the peacetime requirements of the Reichsmarine very well, but were also essentially political, saying to the major maritime powers, we may build a 10,000-ton cruiser with 11-inch guns, whereas yours are restricted by the Washington Treaty, etc., to 8-inch guns. The subtext in the mid-1920s being that Germany, or at least its naval high command, wanted to have the Versailles Treaty restrictions, were imposed and not really very practical, replaced by limitations agreed following German admission to the Washington Club, which was effectively achieved by the 1935 Anglo-German Naval Agreement, despite the subsequent scorn poured upon it, was actually considered a good deal by both parties at the time, for at the time, neither navy wished to fight the other. Another striking image from the years 1936-39 is evocative of the Skagerrak titled Night Torpedo Action. In my opinion, this is among the last of the best of Bergen's naval artwork produced before 1945, for I consider much of his Kriegsmarine artwork, 1935 through 1945, to be rather formulaic rather than inspired. Not that that mattered, for by 1935 the German Navy's revival was accomplished and its position within Hitler's Wehrmacht secure. In that year it was renamed the Kriegsmarine, which can be abbreviated KM, as had been the Kaiserlich Marine. The first Navy Week was staged in early June, of course, and the Anglo-German Naval Agreement was signed. The following year, 1936, to mark the 20th anniversary of the Skagerrak, the massive naval memorial near Kiel was opened. Klaus Bergen was, of course, invited by Admiral Raeder to attend the opening ceremony, and Klaus Bergen's works finished prominently in the Basin Gallery, and indeed still do. Shortly afterwards, in July 1936, the Spanish Civil War began, and immediately a small Kriegsmarine squadron was deployed to protect German citizens and German interests. The squadron went far beyond that remit, of course. Here is Klaus Bergen's painting of the Admiral Scheer bombarding the port of Almere in retaliation for Republican bombing of the Deutschland. And apart from any other consideration, Kriegsmarine operations during the Spanish Civil War firmly established in Hitler's mind the idea that the German Navy was useful. At this point, I'll draw towards conclusion with yet another illustration of the variety of German warships of the new navies Bergen painted between the wars, in almost all cases having been to sea in the vessel concerned. I admire his painstaking approach to his work. I admire his skill and imagination. I admire the end product. The man I consider interesting rather than likable, but he was a man of his times and place. an accomplished artist making a living in an era in which having principles, especially after 1933, could be dangerous. Did he influence the revival of German naval power between the wars? No, I consider that was more a matter for the likes of Admirals Bank and Raeder. Klaus Bergen did, however, illustrate that revival and thereby contributed to the post-1919 political and public rehabilitation of the German Navy.